Killearn Gardens, later Maclay Gardens, began soon after Alfred Barmore Maclay, a wealthy New York banker and financier, married Louise Fleshman in 1919. Louise and Alfred traveled to Tallahassee to visit her brothers Udo and Charles Fleshman at their respective plantations, Wallani and Waverly. Alfred soon fell in love with the area with its large live oaks, tall longleaf pines, flowering dogwoods, and hollies. It impressed Mr. Maclay and offered him the scenic backdrop he envisioned for his gardens. Alfred and Louise had 2 children, Georgiana and Alfred Jr. In 1923, the Maclays purchased an existing plantation called Loch Cowle from John Charles Law, an insurance executive from Cincinnati, Ohio. Mr. Maclay would change the plantation name to Killearn Plantation, so named after Alfred's ancestral home in Killearn, Scotland, where his great-grandfather, the Reverend Archibald Maclay, was born and reared until immigrating to New York in 1805. Mr. Maclay would have the 1906 hunting lodge extensively renovated to transform it into a comfortable country cottage for him and his family. The renovation, which also included a number of outbuildings and smaller cottages, occurred between 1923 and 1925. The main cottage overlooked Lake Hall from atop a rugged hillside. Mr. Maclay saw promise in the surrounding land from which he could mold his dream. The land provided a natural scenic location for his ornamental gardens. Killearn Plantation would eventually encompass over 4,000 acres around Lake Hall and Lake Overstreet. He set forth his vision and began implementing his dream on his newly acquired plantation. James J. Fox, Mr. Maclay's lifelong friend, would assist him in realizing his garden's dream. Mr. Maclay wanted to demonstrate that native and exotic plants could be harmoniously blended to create scenic beauty. The intent of Mr. Maclay was to see that his garden's design would have plants, shrubs, and trees that would be in bloom during the winter and spring, the time the family was in residence. Mr. Maclay was self-taught in the art of landscape design and horticulture and became an authority in the disciplines. His mastery of that art is readily apparent in the diversity of flowering plants, shrubs, and trees that grow round about in his gardens. His goal was to create an environment of beauty which would exist throughout the year. Mr. Maclay was a man of many interests. He was a horseman, raising and breeding champion Hackney horses, a dog breeder, having bred champion Dandy Dinmont Terriers, Greyhounds, and Dalmatians that would win several times at the prestigious Westminster Dog Show in New York. Mr. Maclay is credited with the founding of the American Horse Show Association. He was often asked to preside as a judge at horse shows. He also served as a vice president of the ASPCA. He also had a vast collection of books on the subjects of his interest, some of which were first editions. He was an avid collector of antique furniture, pottery, and glassware. Mr. Maclay would hire Fred Farrell, an experienced horticulturist and gardener from Sompchoppy, Florida, as his gardener and caretaker. Mr. Farrell would ensure that Mr. Maclay's planting designs were implemented when he and his family returned to New York during the summer. Many of the local people worked on Killearn Plantation. There were field hands, maintenance staff, horse trainers, gardeners, and household staff. Many of the locals lived either on the plantation or nearby. The walled garden saw construction in 1935. It was the first phase of the architectural development of the gardens. Mrs. Maclay loved the century plant, so much so that she commissioned Alexander Stoller, a New York sculptor, to copy a century plant she had sent him. The bronze century plant sculpture, which is also a fountain, sits in a small pool in the center of the walled garden. Ground was broken for the construction of the reflection pool around 1935, the second phase of the architectural development of the gardens. Mr. Maclay designed the pool to reflect the deep blue sky and the surrounding trees and plants as you walked from the walled garden. He flanked the pool with sable palms and white azaleas to enhance the visual impact. Mr. Maclay included an ingenious design element to the reflection pool. When looking toward the walled garden from the main walkway, the reflection pool would be hidden from view.
For years, my husband slept with nursery catalogs at his bedside and notes under his pillow. He experimented with a great variety of trees, shrubs, and ground covers.
Mrs. Maclay once wrote,
"The axe, spade, and the willing worker built these gardens." Mr. Maclay, whose joy and vision they were, died in 1944 and did not get to see them reach their mature beauty. Mr. Maclay purchased the Aunt Jetty camellia from the Gamble home in Tallahassee for $75. It was the first camellia planted in the gardens. Many more were to follow. It is thought that the Aunt Jetty was over 200 years old. Sadly, the original Aunt Jetty was lost in 2011. However, Aunt Jetty graftings grow in the gardens today. Join us now for a virtual tour of the gardens during a recent blooming season. We enter through the wrought iron front gates to see a brick walkway which will lead us around the gardens to the Maclay house. Along the way you will see trees, shrubs, and plants that are a result of Mr. Maclay's efforts. The peak blooming season occurs during the late winter and early spring. camellia buds burst into exciting display in late autumn when the cool nip of winter silently approaches. Azaleas dance round about in delicate submission, joining the community of blooms. The early morning sun glitters within dewdrops as they briefly rest in refuge among the silent parade of color. We hope you enjoyed this virtual tour through a beautiful and peaceful place that is the legacy to a remarkable man, Alfred Barmore Maclay. The legacy of Alfred B. Maclay is preserved today through the dedicated efforts of Maclay Gardens State Park staff and volunteers. Sustaining the gardens in the manner that maintains that legacy and the natural resources within the park is the ongoing mission of the Florida Park Service. Thank you for visiting and supporting Alfred B. Maclay Gardens State Park. We hope you will return often to enjoy the real Florida.